and welcome to the sixth edition of the Global Youth Interview Series. I am Dulmanya Thapattu, and in today's episode, we will be talking about Sri Lanka's India First policy. The Sri Lankan government wants to pursue a neutral foreign policy, but will retain an India First approach in strategic and security matters. We have with us Mr. George Cooke, who is also the Deputy Director of the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. He is also a visiting lecturer at the University of Colombo. We will begin with the first question. Recently, the remarks made by Sri Lanka's Foreign Secretary, Mr. Colloquy, regarding the nation's adoption of the India First approach for security policy have welcomed by India. Mr. Colloquy also remarked on Sri Lanka's neutral outlook towards all its economic partners and called the lease of Hambantota port to China a mistake. Let us begin by getting your understanding of these statements and this approach.
Thank you firstly for inviting me and asking me to join this series. And with regard to the statement that Dr. Colloquy made, going forward foreign policy-wise, looking at an India First policy, it is something that has been adopted, has been utilized by leaders in this country for a long time. We've always been conscious of the neighborhood. We're always mindful of the fact of where the island sits. Sri Lanka may be an island, but as I've mentioned on several occasions, it's not an island in that sense of the word. It is not isolated, marooned, cut off from the world. It is an island which has had a lot of history with the world, which has had a lot of engagement and continues to do so. And especially when you look at the South Asian sub-region that we belong to, one of the main players in our sub-region is India. India is our closest neighbor. In times of trouble, in times of want, India is one of the first countries that responds and is the first country that responds. And this is something that we are very much aware of. And it is only natural that it would be incorporated into policy formulation, because in the implementation component, it is very much a part and parcel of how foreign policy has been acted upon. On occasions in which we have decided not to do that, relations have soured, and we have experienced that in the past as well. So depending on whether relations are to sow or they are to sour, it's going to be very important that we focus on the region, on the neighborhood, and certainly on a country like India, which remains a cornerstone in our foreign policy formulation.
Thank you, Mr. Cooke. The next question. The Sri Lankan government has also mentioned that they will not let any foreign power to have higher stakes in any projects over a long period of time, like they did in the case of the Hambantota port. Rather, in all future ventures of foreign investment, they will retain 51% stakes. While many interpret this as a welcoming change, there are some Indian scholars who advise caution, as 49% stakes with a foreign power is still a cause of concern. How do you look at this?
Irrespective of the percentage of the stake, it is very important going into that negotiation, going into the finalization of that agreement, that we are very, very clear on what we want. Because when we sit down for that negotiation, the other side, whatever the side may be, is not sitting there wanting to give in to Sri Lanka, to feel sorry for Sri Lanka, sympathetic towards Sri Lanka. We've got to go out there and get the best for us, because those who are engaging with us want to get the best for themselves. The Sri Lanka First option, preparedness, strategizing, are very important components in negotiation, irrespective of which country we are negotiating with. The size of the country, the power of the country, yes, those are critical factors, but those are not excuses in case we have failed on our side. We have got to be very mindful that when we sit down for a discussion or a negotiation, we've got to go all out to make sure that we accrue as much as possible for our side, for our country. Because you can't expect others to come and dole things out to you. So irrespective of what the percentage is going to be in the future, even if we have a 10% stake in whatever venture, we must know exactly why we have that stake, what we can do with that stake, and get the most out of it. Going forward, when we look at investment, this is exactly surrounding or rather revolving around investment, your question, we need to be mindful of the fact that we don't need investment for the sake of investment. It's not piecemeal, anybody gives us something, we're going to accept it. That should not be the approach. Instead, we should have a national plan, a program, knowing where the country wants to be in the next 5 years, knowing where the country should be in the next 10 years, and then invite investors to come in and fit into the picture that we are drawing, that we are sketching. Because otherwise you have pieces coming together, you have various forms of investment coming together, which is being drawn into the country, which certainly those investors are coming into our country because they have something to get out of our country. They're probably looking at the labor, they're looking at the resources, they're looking at the financial system, whatever it may be. But we've got to be mindful that we are making the most in that equation as well. How do we make the most in that equation? We must know what investment we want, what investment is most crucial, what is going to give us returns in the short, medium, and long term. Once we know that, once we are very, very clear about that, now we can open up for investment. Countries are asking, countries are very interested to know what areas exactly they could get involved in the Sri Lankan context. We must have clear plans, clear projects drawn up as to where these projects are going to help in our development, but it's not going to be development for the sake of development. It's going to be sustainable. We've always got to think of the long term. It's not something that we do for a short term. Investment in a country, improving industry, improving development in the country, it has to be in the long term. We have got to think long term, because it is only then that we are going to reap very sound results.
Thank you, Mr. Cooke. The next question is, what, according to you, is the way forward for both the nations to build on this goodwill and enter greater cooperation?
One of the first world leaders to call the newly elected Prime Minister, Mahinda Rajapaksa, upon his election and the victory of the SLPP was the Indian Prime Minister. Narendra Modi called even before the result was announced. As the results were coming out, when he was very much aware that it was going to be a massive victory for the SLPP. Now, on that occasion, you see the tone is being set for the relationship in the next 5 years, going into the future. This is where the two countries have massive potential. We realize the fact that this happened just a few days ago, when you have that oil tanker of the eastern coast of Sri Lanka, which has been stranded, which caught fire, which had a lot of other complications and can have a lot of implications in the weeks, months, and if not years ahead, if necessary action is not taken. And action has been taken to douse the fire. It started again. But you saw one of the first responders was the Indian military. And this is where, in times of trouble, we've known this from a historical perspective. India has always been around to support, always been around to help, make sure that we are able to either ease the problem or try to deal with it as best as possible. And this was a very, very positive development. It's not a positive thing in the sense of having something negative happening in our waters, but the response, the solidarity that we received was very positive. Instant response from the Indian side. Going forward, this is where we have to look at ways and means through which we are going to strategize our relations. We are very mindful, as you mentioned at the very beginning, we're talking of an India first policy. We have to be very mindful, this is the country that is the closest, that responds the first, that is making a huge name for herself on the world stage. This is the country that when we work with, we have huge opportunities within this country. The market is very large. And this is in both cases. Whether we're looking at it from a trade perspective, whether we're looking at it from an investment perspective, whether we're looking at it from a tourism perspective, whether we're looking at it from an economic angle, whatever the side may be, you see we have not come to that point where there is a level of saturation in any form of our engagement between India and Sri Lanka. We've got to be able to diversify relations, look at ways and means through which we can consolidate it even further. We already have a very strong foundation. There's no two words about that. But that too is not saturated. There's room for how it can be increased, consolidated that much further. Going into the future, this is where we've got to target common ways of how we are going to deal with common challenges we are going to face. We're going to face common challenges in the future in terms of regionalism, in terms of integration, in terms of looking at what is happening right now in the world with regard to the pandemic. We've got all sorts of issues coming up. Some of the issues are unforeseen. They suddenly arise, is the case of the pandemic. Others, we know they are going to come up. We know they are going to be stumbling blocks in relations in the future. How do we go about addressing these things? In the past, we've seen leaders from Sri Lanka, leaders from India having extremely cordial ties with each other. It has been excellent for Indo-Lanka talks, for Indo-Lanka relations, and we've taken it to a very, very high level. This is where we've got to realize the fact that we have, as neighbors, responsibility to consolidate our friendship, to make sure that it is not compromised at any point, that we do not let relations sour at any point. We remove opportunities for such problems. We look at amicable ways through which we can resolve outstanding issues. And there are issues. There are issues that have to be addressed. There are issues that have to be taken in for discussion. And we've got to have those discussions. We've got to find ways and means through which we are going to resolve some of the thorns in the relationship and then ensure that it only grows from there onwards.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. And the final question for the interview. Are there any areas or means of cooperation between India and Sri Lanka specific to the ongoing pandemic?
With regard to the pandemic, there is a lot that we are reading in the news, we are watching on the news with developments happening in India. You know, in the Sri Lankan context, we've been able to control the spread of it at the community level. It is now confined to the quarantine centers. Of course, we are taking very, very high precautionary measures. We are wearing masks, we are ensuring the washing of hands, we are following all the guidelines that have been issued. And people are adhering to these rules and regulations. And this has become a wonderful model that can be replicated. You've had the involvement of the health service personnel. You've had everybody from the health sector coming together, collaborating, making sure that from the health side, there was very strong framework in place. And of course, this is being supported massively with the incorporation of the military. And this has become an excellent model, and a model that can be looked at, being replicated. I know in India, there are various pockets, various areas in which this is rising. I mean, yesterday alone, we heard there was a massive surge in the number of cases reported for a single day. Now, ways and means through which we can address it, how we can provide assistance, so we can go into looking at how we can talk to each other, try to make sure that we share our experience with India. Of course, we understand that we've been doing this for 20 odd million people on our side, and India has way more than that in terms of controlling a pandemic. But there are models that can be replicated. There are models that can be utilized, that can be enforced, that can be very successful on the Indian side as well. We've also got to look at the future. What are we going to do in the future? Something very positive happened a few months ago, and that was where Prime Minister Modi convened a virtual SAARC summit in the light of the pandemic and the issues surrounding it. This is where the pandemic has made us realize that our immediate neighborhood is absolutely vital. Irrespective of the issues we may have with our neighboring countries, irrespective of good, bad, whatever the relations may be, we've always got to be mindful of the fact that whether it's a country with which we share a land border or we share a sea border, we are still in the same area, in the same sub-region as we are in South Asia. Going forward, the pandemic has made us realize that as a region, we have to come together. As a region, we have to work together, because just because one country is able to eradicate or stop the spread of the pandemic, it does not mean that it's going to stop at that point. It can arise at any point in the future. And this is where you've got to make sure the entire neighborhood is safe, not just one country. We have a responsibility of making sure that the whole of South Asia is safe. We've got to make sure that we do not let this spread anymore. How can we do that? Another summit would be absolutely wonderful. The sooner it is convened, the sooner steps are taken to look at ways and means through which we can now go. I know there's a fund that has been established to deal with this particular issue, but we need to now take it a step forward. Look at how we can take tangible action, how countries can help each other, replicate models, use ways and means through which we are going to support infrastructure development in these countries, infrastructure for the formulation of policy, of plans, of various action strategies, which are going to be very, very necessary in case of something like a pandemic. But this is where that can also now be expanded even further. Yes, we'll deal with the pandemic now, and at some point we will get through this. It will happen. In times gone by, we've had situations of this nature. We will get through this. What's our next step? Do we go back to being where we were? No. This has got to be used as a stepping stone for strengthening SAARC. South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation has massive potential. At the beginning, I talked of the potential of India and Sri Lanka working that much closer, the potential of SAARC getting together. When you look at peacekeeping troops coming out of SAARC countries, many of us are not aware that the largest number of peacekeeping troops come from South Asian countries. Now, do we look at it from a South Asian peacekeeping force? At the end of the day, the forces of South Asia are keeping peace in the world. Our countries are contributing so many peacekeeping troops to the United Nations in all their missions around the world. Look at the ample opportunities that we have. Look at it from a tourist perspective. Look at it from an agriculture perspective. We are the granary of the world. We can become the granary of the world. We can start doing this. There is huge, huge opportunity only if we take the step forward of wanting to work together, of making sure that we put the past behind us. Yes, there have been issues that have created problems in the past. We have to deal with that. We have to move forward. Otherwise, we're going to always remain where we are. And that is not what countries want. We're talking about this particular century being the Asian century. This is the century of the whole of Asia, not just one part of Asia. And we are very much a part of that Asia. We have got to contribute to that Asian century. We have got to make sure that our presence is felt in the Asian century. The opportunity has been given to us. The century has been named, termed the Asian century. It's now our opportunity, our time to make sure that we take steps, tangible and intangible steps towards realizing this particular century. And countries like India have a huge responsibility in sharing the benefits of the Asian century. And of course, while sharing the benefits, you've also got to contribute towards it. You've got to make sure that in the South Asian context, we are putting forward, we are placing at the table a consolidated, deeply involved sub-region of Asia.
Thank you, Mr. Cooke. With this, we have come to an end of today's interview. On behalf of Global Youth, I would like to extend our warm regards to Mr. George Cooke for giving us his valuable time and for sharing with us and the audience his insights on Sri Lanka's India First policy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.